Again, you're absolutely right. Pakistan is at the moment chair of the G77 group plus China, representing developing countries. And absolutely, actually, we've been successful in adding loss and damage now onto the agenda as a result of COP27. So we'll have adaptation, mitigation, and a third agenda item now as a result of successful negotiations, and loss and damage as a topic will be included. From a Pakistani perspective, from a developing countries perspective, particularly having gone through these historically catastrophic floods, as you mentioned, a third of the country underwater, 1 in 7 people affected. It was only after having experienced this that we suddenly realized that there is no international financial mechanism to address a catastrophe of this scale. So we're hoping with now loss and damage as part of the agenda, we'll be able to work with the international community going forward. And if today, when Pakistan was hit with such a tragedy, if this facility was not available, we're hoping that the next country to be hit by a tragedy of this scale will have some sort of mechanism available as far as loss and damage is concerned.
So, you know, we understand that Pakistan, for instance, has barely no carbon footprint. The rest of the world has a massive carbon footprint in terms of the developed world. And that's one of the rationales that you all demand compensation and damages. I was interested to hear your Minister for Climate Change, Sherry Rahman. She basically said, or at least somebody said, that, you know, the wonderful, fabulous, historical Notre Dame Cathedral, when it burned, in an instant, they raised something like 900, million euros to repair it. The world promised 100 million a year to mitigate your issues, and it has not provided it. The most it's provided is 90 million. I may even be talking in billions, but the fact of the matter is it's a tenth of what you need compared to a cathedral in Paris. My question is, how do you expect to win your case in the public arena?
So as far as loss and damage is concerned, I think rather than emphasizing this as some sort of, compensation, we should look at this as a collective responsibility. And because loss and damage is a fact, I can show a lot of loss and damage in Pakistan. The small island nations will be able to show you the loss and damage that happens to their countries. It's a fact that we have to address, and we all have to work together to achieve that end. I wouldn't frame it personally as compensation or reparations. It is a shared responsibility of the global community to come together to address not only adaptation, not only mitigation, but also loss and damage. You're absolutely right. Pakistan is, we contribute less than 1%, in fact 0.8% of the carbon footprint, but we are the 8th most climate stressed country on the planet, and in that sense there's an incredible injustice where we didn't contribute as much as other countries perhaps to climate change. We're feeling the brunt of the damages, while the financial commitments, as you mentioned, it's not 100 million, it was 100, I think it was 100 billion per annum, and unfortunately no, that target has not been met. We understand the world is facing incredible economic difficulties as a result of COVID, the war in Ukraine, and a whole host of other issues. So while we still need to sort of emphasize to all those countries that made that pledge that we may have missed the target, or we may be on track to miss the target, but that doesn't mean that we're still not obligated to meet that hard pledge. We also have to come out with out-of-the-box solutions, financial instruments that will allow us to finance adaptation, finance mitigation, and come up with ways to finance loss and damage.
And you're absolutely right. Those figures I was talking about was in the billions. You're absolutely right. Again, to say you've only received a tenth of what the world promised. So let me say that you do have some quite important support for your position from the United Nations, as I found out when I spoke to the head of the UN climate program. Here's what he told me just a few days ago.
The fact that loss and damage has been brought to the fore and is in focus, how much oxygen it takes up, I believe is actually a positive sign, because at last an issue of such significance, especially for the most vulnerable, and for that to be put on the agenda and discussed in a substantive way, seeking constructive outcomes, can only be positive.
So I wonder if you're as optimistic as he is, and particularly you mentioned, and we've been discussing obviously, and I'm in Ukraine, the fallout from the Ukraine war, putting so much more economic stress and all sorts of stress on international commitments.
Absolutely. So I think there's two things. As far as the United Nations is concerned, people say that the United Nations isn't working. And while we may want more from the United Nations, from our perspective, the UN has been fantastic. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been a champion for Pakistan. He immediately arrived as soon as the flooding happened. He was in Pakistan before the UN General Assembly with me, visiting flood-affected areas. He championed our cause at the United Nations. He was at the Pakistani pavilion today at COP27, and hopefully will be working with us going forward for our donors, conferences, etc. We would have been out of the news, off the agenda. You know how quickly things changed on this front. So the United Nations and the support from the UN Secretary General for Pakistan, for climate in general, is absolutely admirable. We have to be, well, I mean, there's a lot of reason to be pessimistic, but we have to find reasons to be optimistic. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic is I believe it's an incredible achievement, particularly on behalf of the G77 plus China, that we have got loss and damage onto the agenda, which means the world will be working on ways and means to address this issue. As far as the Ukraine crisis is concerned, you're absolutely right. This has devastated economies, not only sort of Russia and the Ukraine, but across the world. Fuel prices are high everywhere from America to Europe and in Pakistan as a result of the difficulties from this conflict. And add on top of that the COVID crisis. Add on top of that we're dealing with this climate catastrophe. It's an incredibly difficult situation, which is why we hope and pray for dialogue and diplomacy to take place in the pursuit of peace, so this war can end, so these conflicts of mankind can end, and we can focus on the greater existential threat to the human race as climate changes.
Let me just stick with the war for the moment. Number one, I don't know how badly Pakistan has been hit by the whole, I know you just said energy, but also the grain crisis, because so much of the world's grain, particularly to the global south, comes from this area. But secondly, I wonder what you make of the fact that many people in the developing world, whether it's in Africa or where you are or further afield, tend to buy Putin's argument that this is the fault of the international community, it's the fault of the West, it's the fault of NATO, sanctions, etc. They're kind of buying Putin's narrative. What do you make of that, when we all know that none of the issues regarding grain or the transport of grain, it's never been sanctioned?
Okay, so I can't speak for others. I can certainly speak for myself. I don't think that we're buying Putin's narrative, but I think that the world is a complicated and difficult place. We, from the Pakistani perspective, we've just come out of the forever war in Afghanistan. That has had catastrophic consequences, not only for that country, but has implications for my country as well. We see that the COVID pandemic, which was a once-in-a-100-year pandemic, technically not over, still affecting the entire world. So it's not so much about who's at fault or what went wrong or what's going on vis-a-vis Ukraine, but you're absolutely right, it does directly impact us. As far as wheat is concerned, one of the main countries that Pakistan used to import their wheat from was the Ukraine. Obviously, a war going on over there meant that our food security issues are definitely hit by that. Aside from sanctions, there has been an effect on global fuel prices. That's also affecting us as well. I think no matter what everyone's perspective is, whether they're neutral, whether they come at it from the Russian perspective or the Western perspective, we can all agree that we ultimately want to see this conflict end so we can focus on the important issues, on the existential threat to the human race, which technically should unite us, across the world, from the West to the East, so we can tackle climate change, survive as a planet. Then going forward, we can, fight over our conflicts once we've solved this major issue. Otherwise, there's not going to be a planet.
So, Foreign Minister, your previous Prime Minister, Imran Khan, was a complicated figure. He happened to be in Russia and was seen shaking hands with President Putin the very day after, or the day of, in fact, the invasion. Then, just a few days ago, he underwent an assassination attempt, he says, and clearly he was shot, somebody was killed in that event, and he's calling for an independent investigation. He's calling out many of your senior leaders for not doing enough to keep him safe. What is your reaction to that?
So as far as your first point with Mr. Khan's visit with Mr. Putin, we understand how that could have sent a message that would be misinterpreted that Pakistan was taking sides. But I think Pakistan has, across the political divide, agreed that we want to stay neutral in this conflict. We don't want to get dragged into yet another conflict, and we want to focus on the issues. There's so many devastating crises back home that we have to address. As far as the assassination attempt, the attack on Mr. Khan, I'd like to, on your program, reiterate my utter condemnation, unequivocal condemnation of this attack. There absolutely needs to be a free, fair, and impartial investigation that brings the fact forwards. Whatever anybody might think of Mr. Khan domestically, this has been an attack on a former Prime Minister. An attack on anyone should be investigated in an impartial and proper manner.
And it must have been very, very difficult for you. It's the most serious act of political violence since your own mother was assassinated in 2007. So I can only imagine what you must have thought. But I appreciate you being with us tonight. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you for having me.